Separate from the spacecraft.
Okay, separate from the spacecraft at this time, Hawaii.
Okay, my feet are out. Okay, I'm out.
In June 1965, astronaut Ed White left his Gemini spacecraft to float freely in space.
Okay, I'm coming over.
Okay, stand by.
You see me yet?
I sure does.
Huh?
Just 3 months earlier, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov had been the first to walk in space. America was struggling to surpass the Soviet Union.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
10, 9, 8, 7.
NASA leaders realized just how much they still had to learn to get to the moon.
1, 0. Ignition.
The Gemini program came about to solve fundamental problems. With Gemini, NASA would have a capable spacecraft that could change its orbital plane and height, maneuvers that were beyond the limitations of the Mercury capsule. This ability was important for Rendezvous, an essential technique that had to be mastered before any lunar exploration. Spacecraft builders McDonnell supplied simulators that allowed space pilots to practice on the ground. The capsule also had doors that could be opened by the crew. The Gemini program would have to understand the difficulties associated with leaving the spacecraft and working in weightlessness. Nobody was really sure what the best way to train for a spacewalk was. The zero-G experience in an aircraft could only offer brief periods of weightlessness. In October 1963, there was another intake of astronauts. With the 2-man Gemini spacecraft and the 3-man Apollo craft, the need for new astronauts was pressing. NASA's training had broadened. To cope with emergency landings that could happen anywhere, all astronauts were taught survival and recovery skills. At the Moorhead Planetarium in North Carolina, they learned celestial navigation. While radio ranging techniques would almost always pinpoint a spacecraft's location, NASA was keen to have multiple ways of solving a problem should hardware fail. In the planetarium, a plywood mock-up mounted on a barber's chair taught pilots to recognize significant constellations regardless of their spacecraft's orientation. And geology field trips from the Grand Canyon to Hawaii were organized. For Apollo, this training was essential. In November 1963, President Kennedy visited the Launch Operations Center at Cape Canaveral. He was shown a mock-up of the Gemini spacecraft that was still at least 12 months away from its first flight. At Launch Complex 37B, he was briefed on the family of heavy lift rockets crucial to the Apollo program. This was the first of the early Saturn boosters to have an active upper stage. With this rocket, the US would have an edge over the Soviet Union. Less than a week later, he was in Dallas, Texas. He was there to ease tensions within the local Democratic Party before the following year's elections. Thousands turned out to see the presidential parade. Just after midday, the motorcade turned into Dealey Plaza.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock.
A sniper had assassinated the president.
38 minutes ago.
Vice President Lyndon Johnson took office, continuing the Kennedy agenda, including the space program. While the Gemini system was still sorting out developmental problems, the Apollo program was gaining momentum. In January 1964, SA-5, the first second-generation Saturn I, successfully orbited a heavy satellite. In California, work had started on the Apollo spacecraft. Manned Apollo flights were expected to start in 1965. Gemini planners were trying to compile a launch timetable, but developmental delays with the Titan II kept pushing this schedule into the future. Engineers kept looking to solve the pogo problem without really understanding what caused it. The Titan II's test program had so few successes that NASA began looking at the Saturn I as a replacement. Finally, by early 1964, flight tests demonstrated that the pogo problem had been solved. In March 1964, the new Gemini spacecraft and the highly modified Titan II booster were finally brought together. The first flight, Gemini 1, would be an unmanned orbital mission to test the United System. The capsule was filled with monitoring equipment which would be powered by batteries. The fuel cell technology was not yet ready and was not due to fly until the fifth mission. The Gemini flight schedule had been shaped by the progress of new technologies that were still being refined. The primary driver of the Gemini program, Rendezvous, would not happen until the sixth crewed flight because the Agena target vehicle had still been giving problems. The first uncrewed Gemini flight launched in April 1964 from what was now called Cape Kennedy. It was only tracked for several hours, though it remained in orbit for 4 days before burning up in the atmosphere. It was a complete success. There was to be one more unmanned mission, Gemini 2, to test re-entry procedures. On the 12th of October 1964, the Soviet Union launched Voskhod 1. Boris Yegorov, Konstantin Feoktistov, and Vladimir Komarov were the crew on the first three-man spacecraft. Privately, the Russian Design Bureau referred to it as a circus. There was political meddling in the crew selection, and room in the Voskhod spacecraft was so limited that the cosmonauts could not wear spacesuits. They were in orbit for only 1 day, and the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was deposed during the flight. NASA Administrator James Webb spoke of the Voskhod 1 flight as a significant achievement. Everyone understood NASA's three-man Apollo spacecraft was still in development and would not fly for at least 3 more years. Gus Grissom frequently flew himself to the McDonnell plant in St. Louis, Missouri, to give feedback on refinements made to the Gemini spacecraft. Each Gemini craft had a different setup depending upon its mission, and it became common for crews to visit their particular spacecraft as it was being built. Because Grissom had been so closely involved with the development of the Gemini capsule, it was logical that he was selected to command the first manned Gemini mission. With him would be John Young. Gemini 2, the second unmanned test mission, would be a very short suborbital flight designed to test the capsule's heat shield. The launch had been delayed by 2 hurricanes and some annoying technical glitches. It had been 9 months since the previous Gemini flight, and since mission planners had been hoping for a Gemini launch every 2 months, some at NASA were fearing a repetition of the trouble-plagued Mercury program. Gemini launches continued being controlled from the Mercury-era blockhouse near the launch site. And while the new Mission Control Center in Houston was still not complete, this mission would be coordinated from the Mercury Control Center at the Cape. The capsule was crammed with monitoring equipment, and some fuel cells were to be tested during the flight. They failed during the countdown, but it was decided to continue without them.
8, 7, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
"18 minutes later, the capsule splashed down in the mid-Atlantic. The flight was a success, meaning the next flight, carrying Grissom and Young, could proceed. However, the fuel cells were a technology new to spaceflight, and the developers, General Electric, were having trouble adapting it from a laboratory device to a practical power source. They were vital to Gemini's long-duration flights. Toward the end of 1964, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov began training with a new piece of equipment. His Voskhod capsule would be fitted with a collapsible canvas airlock that would let him leave the craft. The Voskhod capsule's electronics used thermionic valves which relied on the ambient air to dissipate their heat, so the capsule could not be depressurized. In March 1965, Alexei Leonov, on Voskhod 2, became the first person to leave his capsule and float freely in space. Again, the Soviet Union had beaten America in one of the critical steps NASA had stated it would need to master before an attempt at landing on the moon. The complete story did not emerge until after the fall of the Soviet Union. Once outside, Leonov's spacesuit swelled like a balloon, making him too large to re-enter the airlock. Only by drastically venting his suit pressure could he squeeze back inside. Preparations for the first manned Gemini launch had been in progress for some time. A streamlining of management now made the program's tight launch schedule realistic. While the Air Force had used aircraft for booster transport, planes were not always available when NASA needed them. For the first time, a Titan II for the Gemini 3 mission arrived at Cape Kennedy on a highly modified Boeing Stratocruiser called the Pregnant Guppy, a plane NASA could hire independently of the Air Force. Preparations for the flight went smoothly, and Gemini 3 was on the pad ready for launch just slightly more than 2 months after Gemini 2. Grissom and Young arrived at the site 2 hours before launch, and the well-rehearsed procedures went according to plan. Bleachers had been erected so a select crowd could witness the launch.
30 seconds to stand speed.
As the United States' first manned mission in almost 2 years, the flight had attracted considerable media attention.
15. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. And we have a liftoff. We have a liftoff at 24 minutes after the hour.
During the 3-orbit mission, Gemini 3 became the first spacecraft to change its orbital parameters. Re-entry was not quite as planned, with the spacecraft landing around 84 kilometers short of the intended point. The mission was a success, and while it was a simple test of the spacecraft, Grissom and Young returned as heroes. A ticker tape parade in New York. And an audience with the President at the White House. Everywhere the astronauts went, the public support was enthusiastic. Training for the real business of Gemini had already started. Simulators allowed astronauts to gain flight experience without leaving the ground. In an adjacent control room, the simulator supervisor could recreate any type of malfunction that could face the pilots in space. Each Gemini flight was designed to master a new technique necessary for the moon landings. Yet managers understood that much of the hardware needed was still being developed. With delivery dates for new equipment annoyingly vague, the Gemini program was designed to incorporate late changes. This made practice for specific missions difficult. Work on the Manned Spacecraft Center had progressed rapidly, and Gemini 4 would be the first mission to be controlled from the new facility in Houston. Gemini 4 was to be crewed by Jim McDivitt and Ed White. NASA managers were coy about announcing a spacewalk for this flight, but the two astronauts had been training with a mock-up in a zero-G aircraft. While the new fuel cells were still not ready, NASA was hoping to set an American duration record with Gemini 4.
2, 1, 0.
On achieving orbit, the first task was to try to rendezvous with the Titan II's spent upper stage. Every move the pilot made to bring the craft closer just separated them further. After using half the thrust of fuel, Commander McDivitt gave up to focus on the spacewalk.
Status is go for EVA.
Okay, you're go for EVA from here for depressurization.
They depressurized the craft over Australia, but there were difficulties opening the hatch.
Gemini 4, Houston, Capcom.
There were also problems with communication. The ground could hear White and McDivitt, but they were unable to speak to them.
Gemini 4, Houston, Capcom.
I don't want to fire the gun yet.
But once Ed White was outside, there were no problems. He had no defined tasks to perform, and it looked easy.
Okay, I'm coming over. Okay, stand by.
White was enjoying the ride, and he stayed out longer than scheduled.
Oh, there you are.
Houston did not want him to be outside while the spacecraft entered the Earth's shadow.
The flight director says get back in.
Jim, got any message for us?
Gemini 4, get back in.
Okay. I don't know, we're coming over the west end. They want you to come back in now.
After re-entering the capsule, both astronauts had to struggle to get the hatch closed again. The Gemini capsule was the first spacecraft to have an onboard computer that could accurately control re-entry. But just as the astronauts were preparing to return, the computer went dead. The crew manually made a rolling re-entry, coming down 80 kilometers short of the planned landing region. The computer failure could not be induced on the ground. Nonetheless, design changes were made. The locking mechanism on the spacecraft hatches would also be redesigned. As Gemini 4 was being recovered, the Gemini 5 capsule and its Titan II launcher were being united at the Kennedy Launch Center's Pad 19. Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad were the crew for the next mission. They had been making training flights in a C-130 transport aircraft above Texas to gauge their visual acuity before, during, and after their trip to space. Cooper, one of the original Mercury 7, was to lead the mission that would set a new endurance record. He would become the first person to make 2 orbital flights. The General Electric fuel cells were finally ready, and the mission would stretch for 8 days, the duration of a moon mission. For the first time, a spacecraft was equipped with rendezvous radar. And while the Agena target vehicle was still not ready to fly, Gemini 5 carried an ejectable rendezvous pod with which the crew could practice the required maneuvers. Many at NASA felt that if Gemini 5 went according to plan, the country's space program would finally be on par with that of the Soviet Union.
2, 1, 0.
2 hours into the flight, the crew released the rendezvous pod. Soon, pressure in one of the fuel cells had dropped to less than 1/10 of expected levels. Because they were out of radio contact, Cooper made the decision to switch off the fuel cells. This would leave the spacecraft functioning on battery power alone, severely curtailing the mission. Once back in contact with the ground, they were instructed to switch the cells back on, and limited power returned. During the delay, the rendezvous pod had lost its battery power, and mission planners had to improvise. Buzz Aldrin, one of the new intake of astronauts, had a doctorate in orbital mechanics, and he suggested a virtual rendezvous, a rendezvous with a moving point in space. This was successfully executed on the 3rd day, giving mission planners confidence for the next mission, the first to have the much-delayed Agena for a real rendezvous. Reduced electrical power meant Cooper and Conrad had drifted through the rest of the mission and were brought back slightly early because of predicted bad weather in the recovery zone. The spacecraft computer brought them down exactly 130 kilometers off target due to a programming bungle. Gemini Agena Target Vehicle 5002 was ready on Pad 14 for a coordinated launch exactly 101 minutes before the Titan II carrying Gemini 6. As the Gemini 6 crew, Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford, were preparing for launch, 2 countdowns were progressing. The schedule called for 4 different dockings with the Agena. The Gemini 6 spacecraft was limited to a short mission, slightly less than 2 days, because it did not have fuel cells. It was the last Gemini craft to rely on batteries.
4. Holding momentarily. momentarily at 4. We have ignition. 3, 2, 1, 0.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 4, 3,
The Atlas Agena launched flawlessly on October the 25th, 1965. There were still concerns about the reliability of the Atlas booster, but it performed well. 6 minutes after launch, when the Agena upper stage took over, it blew up. Radar detected 5 separate pieces. Gemini 6 was cancelled while mission planners decided what to do. A replacement Agena would not be ready for months. The fault with the Agena was traced to an explosive engine start, and Project Surefire was established to make certain the problem could not occur again. To keep the Gemini schedule on track, Gemini 7, a long-duration mission, was brought forward. And Gemini 6, now renamed Gemini 6A, would rendezvous with it. Although there could be no docking, Gemini planners felt there was still a lot to be learned from such a mission. Docking would now be assigned to Gemini 8. Jim Lovell and Frank Borman, the Gemini 7 crew, had been training in lightweight G5C Grasshopper suits that would keep them more comfortable during their 14-day flight. There would be no spacewalk because the Grasshopper suits were not robust enough for outside use. Both astronauts heeded the advice of Pete Conrad from Gemini 5, who told them to take along good books to read during the endurance flight. The long duration would further test the new fuel cell technology, as well as the spacecraft's thrusters that had shown reliability problems after soaking in a space environment for extended periods. Ground staff preparing Gemini 6A for its rendezvous flight would also benefit from the extra time.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Initially, the crew tried to fly alongside their Titan II upper stage, just like on Gemini 4. They soon stopped because of the complete lack of success and high fuel usage. Spacecraft were not aircraft, and seat-of-the-pants flying just didn't work in orbit. Things at the launch center had to move rapidly. Both stages of a new Titan launcher were erected and mated with the Gemini 6A spacecraft. The plan called for the launch to happen during the 8th day of the Gemini 7 flight, with the first rendezvous several hours later. Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford were being strapped into their craft 2 hours before launch on 12th of December 1965.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
We've got a shutdown.
After firing for 1.5 seconds, the engines shut down. This was the second failed launch for the Gemini 6 crew. Initially, the premature release of a connecting plug was thought to be the culprit, but further inspection revealed a transit dust cover inside a gas generator had not been removed. Meanwhile, the Gemini 7 crew continued to orbit. After much hesitation from medical staff, both Borman and Lovell were allowed to ditch their spacesuits for the comfort of lightweight overalls.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Gemini 6A launched successfully 3 days later. On its fourth orbit, the spacecraft caught up with Gemini 7. Schirra had done some of the maneuvers manually, and the spacecraft's computer had done the rest. For several hours, the two spacecraft traveled together with exquisite precision. Images of the spacecraft in orbit made TV news bulletins around the world. The following day, Gemini 6A re-entered the atmosphere, leaving the Gemini 7 crew to continue their marathon mission. The spacecraft was not in good condition. Thrusters had stopped working and the fuel cells were giving problems. The astronauts had been sitting in the same seats for 2 weeks. One of the main things left to learn from the mission regarded the health of Borman and Lovell. Their return was the most accurate so far, coming down just 12 kilometers off the intended point. A new Atlas-Agena combination was being prepared for the next mission, Gemini 8. The Agena's engine had been modified to eliminate the hard start problem that had destroyed its predecessor. Two untested astronauts, Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott, would fly the mission. Armstrong was the designated commander. He was described as the most experienced test pilot in the astronaut corps at that time. Dave Scott would make NASA's second spacewalk. The crew had practiced during zero-G flights for Scott to strap on an extravehicular support pack that held extra oxygen and propellant to make the extended spacewalk possible. The most important part of the flight plan called for Gemini 8 to dock with the Agena target vehicle. The unreliability of the Agena had frustratingly set back the Gemini schedule. All the remaining Gemini flights now included rendezvous and docking. Gemini 8 was to make 4 separate dockings with the Agena, and the extravehicular activity planned for Scott was more complex than Ed White's Joyride. Like the original Gemini 6 mission, the launch of the Agena and of the Gemini's Titan II were tightly coordinated. 15 minutes after the crew entered their spacecraft, the Atlas Agena lifted off.
2, 1, 0, ignition.
The launch was perfect. Armstrong and Scott were told they would find it waiting in orbit exactly as planned.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff at 16 minutes.
41 minutes later, Gemini 8's Titan II launched correctly. After several hours and a series of carefully calibrated maneuvers, the spacecraft radar made contact with the Agena. On the 4th orbit, they were flying beside the Agena.
Okay, go ahead with your memory compare.
Roger. Flight, we are down.
Soon, the two spacecraft had docked.
Roger, 8, reading you loud and clear. I have some information for you.
This was a significant milestone for the US space program, yet there were lingering doubts about the Agena's attitude control. Before Gemini 8 entered a radio dead zone over the Pacific, Armstrong was told if problems arose, they were to undock.
Command 400 to turn it off and take control of the spacecraft. Did you copy that? We understand.
Soon, the two craft began a slow roll to the left. Nothing Armstrong did stopped the problem, so they undocked. At this stage, Mission Control knew nothing about the difficulties. The Agena was not at fault. The Gemini's number 8 thruster was stuck on, and without the Agena's extra mass, the capsule began spinning faster. As the astronauts' vision was beginning to blur, Armstrong managed to activate the craft's powerful re-entry thrusters. When the ground was back in contact, they realized things were serious. Though Armstrong had stabilized the craft, mission rules stated that the flight must end as soon as possible. After a 10-hour flight, Armstrong and Scott safely landed in the Pacific near Japan. While Armstrong saw the mission as a failure, others noticed his quick thinking under extreme pressure. Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott received an enthusiastic welcome home. The drama in orbit had gained huge press attention.
It's a great pleasure to be back in Houston among all our friends here. We had a exciting ride. We accomplished a lot of things. We wish we could have done a few more. And we'll be spending this week with the staff at the Manned Spacecraft Center completing our debriefings.
Procedures at NASA changed after Gemini 8. Senior managers in the space agency and at the major contractors were either in transit or at social celebrations when their input was needed. Decision makers now had to be available during every mission. Scrutiny of the thruster that had sent Gemini spinning revealed a short circuit, and future Gemini spacecraft were rewired to prevent the problem happening again. By 1966, activity at NASA was frenetic. The refined Saturn I, known as the Saturn 1B, had started test flights, and a major change in management philosophy was being tested with it. The early Saturn rockets, an essential step toward the heavy lift capacity NASA needed for the Apollo missions, had previously been tested in a step-by-step manner, with new stages only added after the previous stage had proven itself. This was logical. It was methodical, and it was very slow. George Miller, director of the Office of Manned Spaceflight, understood the Kennedy deadline could not be met unless this testing was streamlined. He introduced all-up testing where all stages, including the new Apollo spacecraft, were flight tested together. All-up testing was controversial, but it worked, making President Kennedy's deadline achievable. It seemed that sometime late in 1967, Apollo would put a man on the moon. At this point, though no manned Apollo mission had yet been launched, NASA's budgets reached a peak. Vast amounts were invested in development of the new Saturn V, the Apollo spacecraft, and the lunar landing craft. Across the United States, spaceflight was pushed off the front pages by a growing protest movement. Campus unrest had spread to the streets, opposing America's military entanglement in Southeast Asia. US troops and hardware had been inserted into a Vietnamese civil conflict at enormous cost. The space race continued, even while most Americans believed that their country had already achieved superiority over the Soviets. NASA management had developed a quasi-religious fixation upon the Kennedy deadline. Mission schedules, tailored to the delivery of fundamental pieces of hardware, were laid out with the end of the 1960s as the target for the first moon landing mission. Each flight was built upon the achievements of the one before it. But the Gemini program was not unfolding as envisioned. While flexible management had rapidly adapted to the various hardware problems, the Gemini series had suffered. Mission planners realized that after 6 manned missions, the program's achievements fell drastically short of Gemini's to-do list. Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan were preparing for an improvised rendezvous and docking on what was now called Gemini 9A. A previous launch attempt had been called off when the Agena target vehicle had veered off course. Now they would dock with a simple alternative. A docking collar had been fitted to a guidance and control system that would launch on an Atlas. Stafford and Cernan already knew that their docking target was waiting for them. It was June the 3rd, 1966.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The launch was perfect. 3 hours later, they had reached their target, and it was clear that there could be no docking. The nose cone had not been properly ejected, with Tom Stafford likening it to an angry alligator. The Lockheed technician, who usually connected the pyrotechnics, had been excluded from the launch gantry. A scheduled spacewalk by Cernan went badly wrong. He described his spacesuit as having the flexibility of a suit of armor. The Gemini spacesuits were air-cooled and could not cope when an astronaut was working hard. Cernan's helmet fogged and he could not see. Finally, Stafford called the exercise off. Gemini 9A was one of those missions where NASA learned a lot about what not to do. Until this point, astronauts had trained for zero-G work in a modified KC-135 aircraft. When flying in a parabolic arc, the astronauts could experience 30 seconds of weightlessness. But this was not enough time to carry out the extended tasks that were leading to extreme exertion in space. After Gemini 9A, Gene Cernan did some experimental work underwater in the swimming pool at the McDonough School near Baltimore. This gave a more accurate simulation of working in a weightless environment. Apollo engineers were also taking note of the Gemini astronauts' difficulties. The next generation spacesuit would be water-cooled. Unfortunately, most of the new developments were too late to be of use to the Gemini program. Gemini's high launch cadence meant it was difficult to modify the remaining spacecraft by adding hand and foot restraints, but NASA was attempting to make changes in time for the final Gemini mission. At this stage, the Apollo program was gaining greater prominence. At a press conference in Houston, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were introduced as the astronauts who would make the shakedown test of the Block 1 Apollo Command and Service Module on a Saturn 1B.
But it should be within month 6 weeks.
Within a year, unmanned flight testing of the giant new Saturn V would commence. John Young and Michael Collins were the Gemini 10 crew. The objectives of rendezvous, docking, and extravehicular activity remained. Some of the training for Collins's spacewalk was on a low-friction air table. There had not been time to implement an underwater neutral buoyancy program, which again NASA was hoping to have in place for the final Gemini mission. On July the 18th, 1966, the astronauts entered their spacecraft. The launch of the Agena, and then 100 minutes later of the Titan II, were uneventful. Around 5 hours after launch, on their fourth orbit, Young and Collins were station-keeping with the Agena. Docking was smooth. Soon, Gemini 10 used the power of the Agena to boost them to a higher orbit. While passing above Africa, Collins opened his hatch for a stand-up spacewalk. From the higher orbit, he photographed stars in the southern Milky Way. But the spacewalk was terminated when both astronauts complained of stinging eyes. The problem was traced to an overload of the spacesuit's ventilation. The craft dropped back to a lower orbit that allowed them to catch up with the dormant Agena used for the Gemini 8 mission. Michael Collins made a second spacewalk, but it was difficult and it was curtailed because of low thruster fuel levels. 2 months later, Dick Gordon on Gemini 11 had similar difficulties during his first spacewalk. Every task took much longer than anticipated, with fatigue and maintaining his body position being major problems. One objective of the Gemini program had been mastered. The return to Earth was now routinely under computer control, and spacecraft were splashing down within view of their recovery ship. There was only one scheduled Gemini mission left, and yet the program still had not discovered how an astronaut could work effectively outside the capsule in the vacuum of space. A complete underwater training routine was introduced. NASA had set up a Gemini Agena mock-up in the swimming pool at the McDonough School, and they would soon build a dedicated facility in Houston. Astronaut Buzz Aldrin was the first to rehearse his mission underwater. The Gemini 12 spacecraft was fitted with 44 handles and handrails. For work at the back of the spacecraft, where specialist items were stored, tailored foot restraints were installed so an astronaut could anchor himself firmly to eliminate the struggle to maintain body position when using a wrench. As Aldrin and mission commander Jim Lovell crossed to the base of the launch gantry, they displayed the words, "The End," on their backs. The final Gemini flight was to be the most complex yet. This would also be the last manned launch controlled from the Complex 19 blockhouse. It had to be close to the launch tower because the pre-digital instrumentation demanded it. Jim Lovell presented the McDonnell Pad closeout chief, Gunter Wendt, with a redundancy check.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3,
Upon reaching orbit, Lovell and Aldrin began tracking the target vehicle with radar, but reception soon became patchy, forcing the astronauts to rely upon sextant sightings and paper tables to make the rendezvous maneuvers. Aldrin, who had a doctorate in orbital mechanics, used a slide rule for the calculations. This was a good test, enabling the pair to demonstrate the viability of rendezvous via more basic methods. Docking was achieved simply, and the pair practiced the maneuver using different approaches. It was decided to abandon using the Agena to fly to a higher altitude, as telemetry had revealed a loss of engine chamber pressure during its boost to orbit. On the ground, mission planners reinstated an earlier objective, the photographing of a partial solar eclipse. If the Gemini crew could get to the right part of their orbit at the right time, they would have just 8 seconds to photograph the partially obscured sun. It worked. And again, the last-minute change of plan was a good test of the complete team to react quickly as events changed. This meant the crew had little time to prepare for the essential element of the mission, but the hatch opened at the scheduled time, 20 minutes before the capsule passed into the Earth's shadow. This first EVA was a simple stand-up, with Aldrin's legs remaining inside the spacecraft. He was methodical about every move. After almost 2 complete orbits, he was back inside with the hatch sealed. While the mission was going well, engineers on the ground were monitoring worrying signs from the spacecraft's fuel cells. The next day, Aldrin left the spacecraft entirely and made his way to the Agena. He had a completely different approach to his work outside. His experience as a scuba diver and his underwater training, combined with the additional anchor points on the Gemini and Agena craft, transformed the nature of the spacewalk. While working on the Agena, Aldrin attached a tether between the 2 craft, returning to the Gemini capsule after a highly successful 2 hours and 6 minutes. Everything had run smoothly, and mission controllers were delighted. NASA was aware of the high fuel usage involved in station keeping, and they wanted to see if a tether was a practical method to keep 2 spacecraft in proximity. They also wanted to set the 2 craft spinning around each other to generate a small amount of artificial gravity. After almost 4 days in space, Gemini 12 re-entered the atmosphere. The return to Earth was controlled by the onboard computer, and the craft splashed down in the Atlantic close to its recovery ship, the aircraft carrier Wasp. The completion of a difficult yet highly successful series of space flights was celebrated, and NASA felt confident that maneuvers required for a trip to the moon were no longer theoretical.